I'm John Banther, and this is Classical Breakdown. From WETA Classical in Washington, we are your guide to classical music. In this episode, I'm joined by WETA Classical's Evan Keely, and we're exploring the Symphony No. 3 by Johannes Brahms. While each of his symphonies are a masterpiece, his third symphony definitely stands out. We use the first movement to show you more about how Sonata Form works, and how Brahms uses compositional tricks to make a theme. We show you what to listen for across all four movements, why some people wanted to make a scene at the premiere, how a time signature can affect how you play something, and more. Okay, Evan, before we get into Brahms and his third symphony, let's read a recent review. This came from Chen NC on Apple Podcasts, who said, 5 stars program. I've loved your program ever since I discovered it years ago. I've listened to every episode and saved many of my favorites on my phone so I can return to them again and again. And I have to say, I think you're listening more than I am at this point, saving them and listening again, but I love it. And they continue, all of your co-hosts are truly professional and bring great enthusiasm to the show. I especially enjoy the sense of humor that you and your co-hosts share throughout the program. The topics you choose have greatly broadened my horizons in classical music. There are so many outstanding episodes, The Great World of Percussion, Chris Gecker's deep dive into the trumpet, and The Secret Life of a Classical Recording Engineer, just to name a few. The list could go on. Your hard work is appreciated. Absolutely 5 stars. Well, thank you, Chen. That's the whole point, broadening our horizons, and, of course, all of our great co-hosts like Evan Keely here, too.
Well, thank you, John. I'm always glad to be on the show. Glad to hear that Chris Gecker and that fantastic percussion episode were so well appreciated. And Charles Lawson was on the show to talk about the recording engineer's job. I'm always glad to be your guest.
Well, thank you for joining in. And now we're talking about Brahms 3. And I wonder if all or most listeners of this art form go through a kind of Brahms phase. And I think for those that do, it never really leaves you, kind of like Bach. I took a course on all 4 symphonies, and while I don't remember much about that at all besides the listening exam, I remember how much I loved every single one, even though I only play on one of them.
Right, that would be the second symphony, of course, with the tuba part. You know, I feel similarly, John. I love all 4 of Brahms's symphonies. I've listened to them and studied them my whole adult life. Yeah, I think you're right. You go through a Brahms phase. I was an undergraduate, fell in love with Brahms. It never leaves you. I'm still learning about these 4 symphonies. My appreciation for them, my love for them just grows year after year. I don't know which one I would call the greatest of the 4 of them, but the third symphony that you and I are going to talk about today might be my favorite. And part of the reason for this is purely sentimental. Maybe you'll appreciate this too, John. Feel free to make fun of me if you like. You and I both went to music school in Boston. We weren't at the same school. You were at the fantastic New England Conservatory, and I was at the also fantastic Boston University School of Music. We weren't there at the same time, but we both had that Boston connection. And as a college freshman in Boston in the late 80s, I don't know if people know Boston University. It's an urban campus, and as you're walking eastward, you're facing Kenmore Square, and you can see the Boston skyline in the distance. And there I was, this 18-year-old nerd in music school and really excited about my future and walking every day in that direction and looking at that skyline and discovering all this music as I'm beginning this undergraduate degree in musicology. And for whatever reason, that sight of the Boston skyline became linked in my mind with the opening of Brahms' Third Symphony. There's something about that music that's so full of hope and energy and joy and power. And I would see that skyscraper in the distance, and I would hear those 2 chords that we're going to be talking about, and that sweeping string figure that comes in at the very beginning. And that's just, every time to this day, I hear Brahms' Third Symphony, and there's all these evocations of memory and experience for me. I think a lot of us have a lot of these kinds of associations with various pieces that we love. So, you know, like you said, John, you go through a Brahms phase, it never leaves you. And the more you explore and listen to and perform and appreciate this music, the more your love for it grows, I think.
I love how you described all that, and I definitely identify with that as well. I mean, I moved to Boston from like a small Greek fishing town in Florida. So it was a whole seeing a skyscraper like the Peru was, that was a whole another thing.
Yeah.
And it's not just the music; it's the place where you experience it as well
Yes.
that you remember. And you're right; those two opening chords, they're iconic in the repertoire, and it sounds like a tidal wave of sound is just coming up and then crashing over you.
Oh, yes.
And something to notice here, what Brahms does with the orchestration, which he's brilliant at in the entire thing, is listen to which instruments are actually moving the most in terms of distance in these chords. The lower ones have a larger leap. The higher ones are moving less. And they're providing more tension with the notes that really bring us up the F and the A flat up to another F. That it soars in a way that you get when you have them moving at different intervals like this.
And these iconic two chords that open this symphony, all of the woodwinds are sounding, except for the contrabassoon.
Yeah.
So it's a very windy opening. The four horns and the two trumpets are also there. And then, the strings and the timpani are completely silent for those two iconic chords. And then all of a sudden, the full orchestra bursts in.
And maybe we can actually expand on some of what makes up sonata form using the first movement, because what Brahms is doing here is very, very clear. And we're still looking at this from quite a bird's eye view, because sonata form can be a big, tangled music theory mess that I don't even like that much. But from a bird's eye view, we look at sonata form as having three main sections: an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. In the exposition, a composer introduces the big themes or melodies, which in music theory are called subjects. So the first subject happens right after those two chords. It's the big tune introduced by the strings.
Yes, that's our first subject. But this opening is also similar to the opening movements of the previous two symphonies of Brahms. Both the first symphony and the second symphony, the first movement, there's a very sort of subtle thing that happens at the very, very beginning, and then you have a very recognizable, very clear piece of thematic material. And what Brahms is actually doing, it's the first thing that you hear is not just sort of introductory, kind of let's set things up and then here's the subject. They're actually both the subject. And if you listen to the whole movement in all three of those symphonies, the opening movement of all three, the first, second, and third symphonies of Brahms, the very first thing that we hear is actually part of the subject. So these first two chords in this third symphony aren't just sort of setting the stage for, we have this tremendous melody that comes bursting in, the violins are in octaves and so forth, and it's a very recognizable and memorable tune, and that's wonderful. But those two chords are also the subject, and you'll hear both the very recognizable melody, but also the elements of those two chords, both harmonically and melodically throughout the movement. So Brahms kind of tricks us. He kind of it looks like he's just setting the table and then here's the meal, but the whole thing is the meal.
Yes, it's both this subtleness and obviousness that Brahms does at the same time. Now, this is the first subject, first theme. There's also going to be a second theme within this first subject, and it's pretty close behind. And it's pretty much always going to be in the same key as the first subject, first theme, because they go together. This creates a nice stable opening and then a nice contrast to something that we just heard. Then, after we get this first subject, first theme, and then a second theme of the first subject, we start to move away. There's a little bit of a tonality shift. You hear we're starting to move away from the key, because we are getting ready to go to our second subject, and we want that to be a big contrast in a new key. And so, within just like a minute and a half, we get the first theme of the second subject, these beautiful lines on the clarinet, and they get really soft, especially when they repeat anything, and then they pass off to other woodwinds. And then from this, we also get like a contrasting pizzicato idea as well. Okay, Evan, we had first subject, first theme, first subject, second theme. We just heard the second subject, first theme. Now we expect we get another theme to contrast that one, just like in the first part. what Brahms does here, he takes the melody we heard on the clarinet, but now inverts it. That's when we take like a melody and you say, okay, it goes up by a major second. Well, I'm going to go in the opposite direction, and you go in opposite directions for each interval. So it feels like a new distinct tune, but it's really, really just what we heard as well.
Yeah, it's basically the way to think about it is that the tune is upside down. So where it went down before, it goes up this other way, and it's the same tune, but it's not. And this is inversion. Brahms loves to do things like this, and you have inversion in a lot of Brahms pieces, augmentation and diminution, where the tune gets twice as long or twice as short. Brahms is a very intellectual composer in that way. People that don't like Brahms find this, too cerebral or whatever. Mm-hmm. But all due respect to them, I disagree. I think that Brahms, one of the things that makes Brahms so great, and you really hear that in this first movement of this Third Symphony, is the way he's able to use these very cerebral, very intellectual, musical, technical things and create something that's beautiful and beguiling. Even if you're not consciously aware of it, if you're not technically proficient in these kinds of concepts, it still affects you. It still draws you in. It still moves your emotions. It still has an aesthetically appealing quality as well as being intellectually satisfying. So Brahms is able to give us something on so many dimensions that's really just a profoundly great work of art.
I think dimensions is a good description because after this part that we just heard, we hear still a bunch of opening, what I call like the opening 3-note motifs, kind of outlining that chord, and it comes back in different ways, very subtly, sometimes very obviously. And what we notice in this section is now we're starting to drift away even more. We drifted from the first subject into a different key for the second subject. Now it sounds like we're drifting even further away, preparing for an even bigger contrast, but remember, the exposition, the entire section, repeats. And as it feels like we're about to go into some huge thing, we go right back to the beginning. And this can have a distinct feeling. Like in Mahler's Sixth Symphony, I think it's very anxiety and daunting, and I think that's the point. But with Brahms, it sounds so natural, almost unnoticeable. But when you hear the exposition repeat, listen for what happens a little bit differently. It's the same parts, but like the clarinet, for example, I think plays much softer, almost nefariously soft for their section mates, I think. But Evan, as we get back into these opening chords, there's something else we can think about, and that is some think that there is a motto, something imprinted here in the music, similar to Joseph Joachim, who had Frei aber einsam, free but lonely. Brahms is doing something similar here, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of sort of musical games that go on, and we're not really sure whether or not that's applicable to this symphony. So you mentioned Joseph Joachim, good friend of Johannes Brahms, marvelous violinist, very fine composer. And his personal motto, as you mentioned, John, Frei aber einsam, German for free but lonely. Brahms, they were part of this sort of intellectual circle of musicians and composers. There's the FAE Sonata, to which Brahms contributed, I think, the third movement. FAE, the pitches F, A, and E, Frei aber einsam. It was this musical tribute to Joachim. So you find these kinds of musical games in a lot of Brahms pieces. And the question is the Third Symphony one of these instances? Because we have F, A flat F at the beginning of this symphony. It recurs constantly, Frei aber froh, which was Brahms's motto, free but happy. And so, and again, what do these mottos actually mean? That has something to do with their relationships with women to some extent, but also their relationships with the artistic world. And, there's all kinds of things we could get into with that. I don't claim to have a sophisticated understanding of that. But what I do feel is that I'm actually quite skeptical that this symphony is an articulation of Frei aber froh, that's encoded into the music. And I'm much more interested in the idea that what Brahms is doing is actually borrowing an idea from Schubert. And you look at the opening, the very famous opening of the fantastic, colossal string quintet, which is a tonic chord followed by a diminished chord, which in that era sounded quite remarkable. And Brahms is doing exactly the same thing harmonically in this symphony, and he plays with that throughout the movement, even more so than Schubert does in his string quintet. So you have these two chords which are borrowed from a very famous Schubert piece, which surely Brahms knew and did I think, very consciously. And you have this F, A flat, this minor third, which is also very important in this whole movement and even in the whole symphony, especially as we get to the end of it. So, whether or not Brahms is trying to make a personal statement about being free but happy in this symphony is, I think, a fascinating question. But I think it's much more, to me personally, much more interesting to think about his relationship with a composer like Schubert, his relationship with a composer like Joachim, and what he's trying to say within the context of music in the 19th century, rather than expressing his feelings about whether or not he was still a bachelor.
Yeah, I tend to agree. He wasn't one putting these encoded things into his music. And then why would he do it for this big symphony, especially since it was I think 6 years or so since the last one. I don't know. I think you are onto something there, especially with the Schubert string quintet. And actually, as you get towards the end of the exposition on the repeat, you expect those chords to return. But instead, we start transitioning to something else, the development section. And this is stormy. It is passionate. We get a very passionate version of the second subject at the start. Wonderful offbeats that the orchestra strings have the time together. And it feels like you are a ship at sea in a storm, which I feel like is the most classic, almost cliche description that I use for the development section, Evan. It feels like you are at sea. And this is the section, the development section, where we get different tonalities, different keys. We are really moving away from what we heard in the first subject and the second subject. These are now getting expanded on. But we're also going to settle kind of as you expect in a symphony, halfway, 2/3 of the way through. And we get more of these beautiful 3-note motifs that I've heard more now than I ever did when I took a class on this, Evan. And especially on the horn, it sounds like a beautiful sunrise that is coming out. And that also makes me think, maybe it is not so frei, aber froh in that case. Something I want to point out, Evan, that is one of my favorite aspects of Brahms entirely is his orchestration, how he pairs the instruments together, because how he writes lets you hear every single detail. There are so many recordings or even works that I've played on where you're not hearing a lot of some of the stuff that's going on. It's covered up or something. Brahms is very, very clear. Listen for the contrabassoon, how deep and rich it is, not just here, but throughout the symphony.
Yeah, I agree, John. Brahms is really skilled at orchestrating in a way that provides a sense of fullness, but also there's that extraordinary clarity. He knows how to pair instruments and instrument groups. This symphony, the Third Symphony and the Symphony No. 1, have a contrabassoon. The Second and the Fourth Symphonies do not. So, it's always interesting to me in this era in European music who's using the contrabassoon and these other very low instruments.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder if the inclusion of that instrument is a kind of a nod to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which was quite unusual in that era for having a contrabassoon.
Mm-hmm. Also, in the Ninth as well, there's these random punctuated contrabassoon notes as well. So I can definitely see that as well. It can also be a trademark of just how careful his orchestration is. He doesn't use everyone in the orchestra merely because they are a member, which is what happens oftentimes, especially with commissions. But I find some similarities here with how he uses tuba and contrabassoon. And overall, Evan, this is not a long development section. Sometimes these are long and you really go on an adventure. This, we're just kind of going off the path. And then eventually you get back onto the path because we had the exposition, the development, now recapitulation where we recap. We are brought back to the opening chords. Now you hear it also doubled in length sometimes or repeated. And that adds a lot of tension, makes this wave even bigger. And in the recapitulation, this is where we hear the the first themes that we heard in the exposition come back in the original key and also the original instrumentation.
Yeah, so we're back where we started pretty quickly. Brahms's developments tend to be very economical. It's one of the ways in which Brahms is often regarded as a more conservative composer. You look where the symphonic form went in the Austro-Germanic tradition in Brahms's lifetime already, and also beyond it, Bruckner and Mahler, where the development section is this vast journey, just in terms of the length of time that the composer spends on it. That's really the direction the symphony is going in historically, and Brahms is not on that train. He's taking a train almost to, this is where we think of Brahms as a neoclassical composer, where his development sections are much more, even harking back to the classical era, the Haydn Mozart era, where you have a very succinct development section. It's very economical. We get back to the recapitulation in a timely way. And again, that's not criticizing. It's not a value judgment. It's just interesting to notice how Brahms is so different from what comes after him.
And we can also think about the 18th century for a second, because the recapitulation, it's in the home key, and you can actually technically end here. And I think I've demonstrated this before from time to time, but you can just straight up end. And in the 18th century, with someone like Haydn or Mozart, it actually might typically end just like that. But now in 1883, we get an extra section called a coda. This is when you often hear everything being wrapped up with a bow, because now, even though Brahms is, more traditional, the recapitulation has some great energy and things happening in it. It's almost like we've done too much with the recapitulation. Now we need an extra thing to close it all out. And I think you hear this in pop music and all over the place as well. It's like it sounds like the song is already over and we are just wrapping it up.
Well, the coda is kind of like an epilogue in a novel. We're summarizing themes. But there's also, as you point out, there's some new things here as well. One of the things Brahms uses really effectively in this symphony and in a lot of his works is fragmentation. You have sort of snippets of thematic material, maybe it's just like 2 or 3 notes. You'll hear that over and over again. It gets smaller and smaller, and then it brings us back to a full statement of a subject. And that really gives a sense of finality, a sense of completing a journey.
Mm-hmm. So this entire movement is like a massive ship. That's how I feel about it, with Brahms steering it. So it's this big ship that you can't, of course, stop or turn very quickly. It takes preparation, a lot of thought and planning to get where you want to go. And this is when a conductor and their interpretation can make a huge difference, because they are following this path, and when they add something extra or do something a little bit more, it really brings attention to it. Like with here, Sir Simon Rattle and the Berlin Philharmonic, one of the greatest string sections. They add tension, the tempo gets this anxiety, it really kind of compresses and then decompresses for a moment, and then we end soft with these rich and decadent chords that, for me, is like, it's one of my favorite things of Brahms.
Yes.
How he puts these notes together, it's like a rich dessert. Let's talk about, for a second, before we get to the second movement, Evan, Brahms and his rather small orchestral output, because we have to remember he only wrote 4 symphonies, and he took a long time writing them, and it sounds like he also didn't write a lot more for orchestra.
Famously took a very long time to write that first symphony. But so interesting to think about his orchestral output. The number of solely orchestral works that he composed is actually quite small. The 2 serenades early in his career, there's the 2 concert overtures, the Tragic Overture and the Academic Festival. The Haydn Variations got orchestrated. And there's these 4 symphonies. Other composers wrote more symphonies. There are other works with orchestra, of course, the 4 concertos, the 2 piano concertos, the violin concerto, the double concerto. The German Requiem is a choral orchestral work. There's a bunch of choral orchestral works that are a single movement, like the Gesang der Parzen and the Alto Rhapsody. Mm-hmm. But even those are not great in number. So not a very prolific orchestral composer. Great quantity of solo piano music, a pretty substantial body of lieder, quite a lot of chamber music, not a lot of orchestral music. But when Brahms does write for the orchestra, as we're seeing as we examine this Third Symphony, I don't know if I would think of Brahms as a titan of orchestration, like someone like Maurice Ravel, for instance. But in terms of his innovative thinking, his creativity, he's not daring. He's not a revolutionary orchestrator, but he knows what he's doing. He knows how to craft things that really work. There's a superb craftsmanship to what he's creating, and as we've been pointing out, the subtle things that he knows how to do as an orchestrator are so effective and beautiful.
I love your description there because, yeah, he wrote so few, but they are quite astounding. And the orchestration, while not like revolutionary, it's like he exploited every aspect that was possible to create this sound from that time and place. Okay, so let's go ahead and move to the second movement, which opens with clarinet. Again, like I said, you're going to hear some beautiful clarinet playing in this symphony, and this is astounding. This is some of the most beautiful writing, in my opinion, with the clarinets. There's some close harmony, the strings follow afterwards, and this whole thing, and the symphony, but this especially, this feels like one of those flowers that blooms once a year in the middle of the night. There's this just beautiful unfolding and blossoming that I hear in this.
I totally agree, John. These first two bars, there's an almost religious quality. Even the musical structure is like a chorale, and then you have these dotted rhythms and dum da dum da dum, and I can't help but think of the slow movement of Schubert's great C major symphony, where those dotted rhythms just have this elegance and this gentleness about them. They're so often used to express something very pompous and heroic, which is wonderful, but here it's just so subtle and so gentle and so exquisite.
This music feels like just the biggest, warmest hug from the most safest person, maybe Brahms, that you could imagine.
Yeah.
And this little melody, it returns constantly. In a little bit, it returns with these beautiful counterlines in the upper winds, these eighth notes that I can't even maybe explain the feeling or what it is, but it's just the warmest sound. And I think this is one of those things I'm talking about where he exploits every little opportunity to make this perfect sound. And how this comes back again and again, Evan, it makes me think of maybe this is some type of little song or lullaby, like something you really know and you sing or hum often, but maybe you're only singing and humming one part or a few words of a melody as you're going about your day. That I get that type of feeling with him too. But one section I want to point out, Evan, is this moment of pause where a few minutes in, it's like Brahms needs to take a second to think about what's actually going to come next. And this shows how a composer can prepare us. It sounds like we're searching for the right note to start for the next melody. Just this, gentle repeating of a note. It's going in one player to another. It goes on for like 30 seconds before the strings hit. Here's the note. Now we continue.
And a lesser composer, this would get kind of boring or weird, or it'd feel like it's losing momentum. But this fragmented set of statements really sustains interest, I think. I'm at the edge of my chair. What's going to happen next?
And this will actually come back again. We have beautiful leading from the clarinet that passes lines off to flute and bassoon, but that searching sound comes back, and then it blossoms more into the original theme. And more things to listen for that we heard in the first movement, these three-note motifs, as I call them, coming in and out, and more deep orchestration. Listen for the contrabassoon and their sounds, and some of these have the violin sliding around a little bit, more of that searching from the start, but eventually it winds down, and it feels just so cozy, so warm, kind of pastoral too, with like this drones in the winds.
One of the things I love about this movement is how subdued so much of it is. So when there are those moments of real yearning and intensity, they really stand out, but they're fleeting. And then we're back to those fragments and things that are just very subtle. And there's that coziness that is so enticing.
And we will get into Wagner versus Brahms and the premiere right after this. Okay, so this symphony premiered on December 2nd, 1883, with Hans Richter conducting the Vienna Philharmonic. And there was some tension in the hall because there were these fans of Wagner and Liszt who were pushing music in a different direction from the conservative Brahms. And there was like this little bit of feud. And even though Wagner had been dead for nearly a year when this premiere happened, there were some Wagner fans there. And it sounds like they made their thoughts known with maybe some hissing and some booing, that type of thing. It's very sports fan-like, I think.
Yeah, this is a work from 1883. Brahms is 50 years old at this point. He's really, you could say, at the height of his powers or nearing the height of his powers, both professionally and personally. He's enjoyed a great many successes at that point, 2 other symphonies, of course, the 2 concert overtures, the Handel variations, the Haydn variations, the 2 piano concertos, the violin concerto, all 3 piano quartets, the piano quintet, the string quartets, the 2 string sextets. Quite a substantial body of lieder he's written at this point, and of course the German Requiem was some years before this, so he knows himself as a composer at the age of 50. And unlike the oft-quoted anxiety which attended his getting his first symphony finished, he made that comment about the footsteps of a giant. You know, he's trying to follow in Beethoven's footsteps and how anxious he feels. It took maybe 20 years or a very long time to write that first symphony. The second symphony comes along not too long thereafter, and then this third symphony is 6 years after the second symphony. So he's really coming, I think, from a place of confidence as a composer, despite the booing and hissing from the Wagner fans. This is really the work of a mature composer who understands his own voice, I think.
I agree, basically completely. The third symphony, it feels like this is confidence. Even though it was first symphony, we understand what was going on behind it. It can sound confident in its own way, but this really feels like, every single thing is exactly as he wanted and not as maybe someone else would accept it as, that kind of thing.
And this whole Wagner versus Brahms tension is, I think that's a fascinating subject. Obviously, 2 very different composers. Brahms memorably noted that 2 things he never tried were marriage and opera. So that's one obvious difference between Brahms and Wagner, who Wagner, of course, never wrote a symphony. So they have very different goals as composers. They have very different styles. Their intentions are very different. Their personalities, I think, were very, very different. I certainly very much admire what Wagner achieved, but there's every reason to believe, in addition to his despicable anti-Semitism, for which he is justly infamous, probably just an insufferable megalomaniac.
Oh, yeah.
Wagner was very eager to put his personal stamp upon what he created. He really wants to insert himself into his music. And Brahms, I think, is nearly the polar opposite. We're sitting here wondering if, Frei aber froh, his personal motto, is even in this score at all. He's a really much more sort of introverted personality. He wants to keep himself to himself. I think Brahms is one of the most absolute of absolute music composers, absolute music versus program music, music where there's not it's just about forms. It's about notes.
Yeah.
He's not trying to tell a story, or there's no symphonic poems in Brahms's output, at least not in an explicit way.
Yeah.
And John, you and Bill Bukowski did an episode on Classical Breakdown back in 2023, The Life and Music of Brahms, and Bill you both made a lot of very insightful comments on that episode. One thing Bill said, which I thought was really interesting, was Brahms was self-aware. I really stuck with me. And as I think about Brahms and I think about this third symphony, for instance, what is the 50-year-old self-aware Brahms doing in expressing himself in this third symphony? That's one of the questions that I find really fascinating, especially as we compare him to a composer like Wagner or Liszt and the context in which he's expressing himself in this third symphony.
Yeah. self-aware, almost too self-aware, as many composers are. This dichotomy of this confidence, but also this self-awareness that he had as well. But Evan, did you know that Wagner did write one symphony? It's not really worth listening to.
I did not know that, actually.
I haven't heard it in like a decade. It was, it's in C, and it reminds you the entire time, hey, this is in C. And it was a youthful work of his, and I think he just kind of, moved on, rightfully so, to opera. But yeah, he did write one, not that great in my opinion. Okay, the third movement. This, in a way, it feels like it picks up right off from the previous movement and note. The first two movements ended softly, and we're going to have the same thing with the last two movements here. I think he creates a lot of emotional tension here, but now it feels like it comes in waves, and we're led by the strings. And something that is also interesting about like the tempo and how it's written is that we are in 3, which is common for a third movement in a symphony, but we're not really fast and we're not really slow. So it's not a waltz. It's not something more reflective, deeply in a different way. So it feels like this is something that is also taking place in our minds.
Yeah, this is just such a wonderfully beautiful movement. And as you were saying, John, structurally it's kind of odd. It is in 3. The tempo is too slow to be a scherzo. It's even too slow to be a minuet if you want to go back to the 18th century. So it's almost as if this symphony has 2 slow movements. And even the first movement, Allegro con brio, has the actual beat is a dotted half note. Mm-hmm. There's kind of a maestoso quality to the first movement. So much of the symphony is really slow. And this third movement is it's just kind of strangely slow, but wow, what a movement it is. And to say that it's strange or unusual is not to say that it therefore doesn't work. An unusual aspect, I think, of this whole symphony is that Brahms in many ways is going his own way, is quote-unquote conservative as we often think of Brahms. He's kind of doing his own thing here. And one of the things that makes the work so powerful and effective is that it all makes sense.
And one of the things that I think helps with this is just the meter, the time signature he wrote. This is in 3/8, not 3/4. 3/4 is very common. There's 3 notes in a measure, and the quarter note's getting a beat. In 3/8, the 8th note is getting a beat, and there's 3 8th notes in each measure. So how it looks like is when you have something in 3/4, and it's kind of being conducted in 1, you are really moving forward. You're seeing quarter notes and 8th notes, and it really moves forward in a very specific way, and your eyes are moving across the page quick. In 3/8 and this kind of thing, you're playing more 16th notes and 8th notes. So while the amount of time they're taking up is the exact same, they are written a little bit differently. And in 3/8, your eyes are moving slower, and when you have these 8ths and 16ths, I feel like you can really settle in. It's like when you look at slow Bach movements in like a solo violin part, there's like 30-second notes everywhere, but it's very, very, very slow. So there's a psychology, that's not the right way to describe it maybe, but there's some kind of psychology as well with how music is written. It's just like how music is printed in a book.
And I think 3/8 is also the time signature for the slow movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So I wonder about a connection there. Also, this is a kind of an odd movement. It's in a minor key. It's in C minor, which is the parallel minor to C major, which is the dominant of F major. So, it's not a strange key to be in, but the fact that it's minor is a little odd. Its overall tone also strikes me as being quite different from most third movements of symphonies I can think of. A lot of them have a scherzo, and it's often very lively. I mean, the word literally means joke, and of course you get into the 19th century, a lot of those jokes are not intended to be funny. But this is this very sort of lyrical, it's just sort of a strange choice, but so exquisite. This starts off with those cellos playing in the high register, like the second subject of the first movement of the Second Symphony. That's sort of the tune that sounds a little bit like his famous lullaby. High cello playing has that certain quality that's so exquisite. And then, we get to the end of that section. We go from C minor to C major. There's a Picardy third, but it kind of can't quite settle into the major right away. But we take a little bit of a circumlocutus route to get there.
And what I mean about this movement taking place in your mind, it really sounds like we have another searching moment, but instead of just, notes being repeated trying to find something, it's like we're slowly combing through memories in our mind. Peacefully late at night, you are thinking, and you're just remembering this. And one of the big things that happens in this movement, Evan, is the big horn solo using the main line. We know Brahms loved, and he played the horn also.
Yes.
But he preferred the natural horn that had, of course, no valves. But at this time, the valved horn was quite common in 1883. It was basically standard. And you're also always going to hear this on a valve horn as well. I think it just works better. It's a lot of crunchy notes together, I think, for natural horn to really make it nice and smooth. But it is one of the big excerpts for horn players. And after this solo, the movement starts to wind down, and listen for how the horn is acting more like a wind player, like a woodwind player. They're often grouped with them as well, because they are acting more like one of them, a clarinet or something, as they pass off lines to oboe and other winds. And then we settle down. This is the shortest movement in the symphony. This beautiful sustain at the end has these winds with pizzicato strings. And one of the things that we hear is also the cello has 3 notes in the second to last note, while everyone else is still having one pizzicato. They have 3 notes they have to play, either all at once together, or maybe they split it up within the section. And now, Evan, it is time for the finale. We've had soft endings to all of these things, and you might think something big and loud and energetic comes here. It's actually soft. It's a soft opening that's written piano. It's soft, and it even says sotto voce in the score for the strings, so basically like under the voice, hushed. It's like it's between like piano and whispering. You really take it under a little bit.
And as we've been saying throughout, when this symphony is really loud and strong and passionate, because he holds that in check so much of the time, when it does happen, it really has an effect. So this very subdued opening to this finale is really catches your attention. Like the piano trio in B major, this symphony is grounded in a major key but ends in the parallel minor. The last movement of both of those pieces is in the minor. Although, spoiler alert, this symphony will end in F major where it started. So that's another kind of a strange choice. We have this kind of strange C minor third movement, and now we have an F major symphony ending, at least at the beginning. For most of the movement, we're in F minor. So kind of an odd, quirky setup, but again, this really works. Another strange thing about this symphony that still works really well. And we should also mention, the movement before this is C minor. The transition from C minor to F minor, that's a subdominant chord change, is the simplest, the easiest chord progression in all of tonal music. I don't remember who it was that said modulating to the subdominant is like falling out of bed. So going from C minor to F minor is the easiest and most expected modulation, and a great way to end the symphony.
And yeah, I think now that you've mentioned this before as well, I'm hearing this a little bit, at least in my head with some of his other symphonies. I'm definitely going to think about that more. We also get like a religioso section with these hemiolas 2 against 3, and then suddenly a loud moment followed by a subito, suddenly soft moment. And from here, the tension builds up to a major key, and still listen for some of the deep orchestration in the bassoon. And then the next theme, it's similar to the hemiola rhythm that he just introduced, but now it's not just like on one note, it's rather this beautiful expansion of it.
Yeah, I have this idea in my head. I've never found a way to articulate it. The noble theme. A lot of these Brahms fast movements that are in a minor key have a second subject that's in a major key, and it often has this very noble quality. I think, for example, of the string quintet, this very sort of stormy F minor, and then we get into this major key tune, this second subject, da dee da dee da 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 dee da dee, and it's very sort of heroic and triumphal. And here again, we have this sort of this noble quality in this second subject that's so characteristic of Brahms.
I think you're right because, I mean, we're talking about all kinds of other symphonies and his other ones, but his first symphony in the finale does the basically the same thing with this noble tune type of chorale that comes in.
Yes.
This builds up, and it feels like we are really in some of the most tense moments of the symphony yet. This battle or conflict that you might expect in the first movement development. We get this chromaticism, but it's like we are in its own development section here that is quickly moving off in different directions. And also thinking about Bill Bukowski again, who mentioned another quote of his is like, a symphony is a musical problem the composer is working out, and sometimes it's programmatic and sometimes it's not programmatic. And here, you wonder what is the problem that's being solved here? What is the struggle? And when we get to this finale, it feels like, yeah, we've had all this confidence, but this has also been a noble struggle as well. Something heroic, but also contemplative about it as well. It's a lot of things that he mixed in, but it overall feels like this is our noble conquering or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. Again, with Brahms, you really have to be careful because he is so intensely avoidant of expressing any very specific personal things in a public way. So to say, oh, this is about, this is expressing his heartbreak about this or, you really don't want to get into that with Brahms with any great confidence. You can certainly use your imagination, but if we're going to make a decisive statement, we just don't know. That's the decisive statement. Brahms doesn't want us to know. So I listen to this finale, and am I hearing pain? Am I hearing heroic struggle? Is this a triumphant movement? Is it all of the above? I don't know, and that's part of what makes it so exciting is that we don't know.
And Evan, as also promised, the ending here, although it's quite tumultuous leading up to it, it's quite soft. We don't get a big, loud ending. Every single movement ends soft. And there's not a lot of symphonies that do that for every movement. Ending soft is one thing, but it all...
Every single movement, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this would have been a very exciting movement if it ended in a fortissimo F minor.
Mm-hmm.
That could have worked very well. Another composer could have done that quite skillfully, and Brahms does something that's even more interesting, this very gentle ending, and a very gentle return to the very opening thematic material. And very appropriately for this symphony, the winds really have the final say.
And thank you for reminding us, Evan, that it is a very gentle return to that very opening thematic material that happened after those chords 35 minutes before this point. And this also makes me think that for some of the Wagner fans and the stands in the audience, I wonder how many of them who heard this in the premiere, it's the first time they're all hearing it, actually kind of like the end, because we're resolving something that we heard 35 minutes before. And it's really slowing down. It's very soft. It's really, really dragging out. I wonder if some of them thought like, hey, this kind of reminds me of the end of Parsifal a little bit.
Yeah.
And then it ends and, the other Wagner fan next to them boos. Oh, yeah, boo. I don't like this. That I just wonder. I never thought about that before until like yesterday when I thought about listening to this from a Wagner fan or, a hater's perspective. And I wonder if some of them thought, hey, that was I liked how he did that.
Yeah, there is a Parsifal kind of quality, that sort of sanctity with which the piece ends. Mm-hmm. There's a sense of being cleansed. There's a sense of coming home. again, quoting the very beginning of the symphony at the end, this is not a cyclical symphony. You don't have themes that recur across multiple movements. He doesn't do that. You can do that. Other symphonies do that, especially in this era, quite a bit. But that's not what Brahms is doing here. He just happens to be quoting very briefly at the very end what we heard at the very beginning. It's very subtle. Again, it's that combination of the obvious and the subtle in Brahms that is so effective.
And I can't believe it took us this long to explore a Brahms symphony. Maybe I thought, we just can't do it justice. But I think a lot of what we talked about here now today is useful for all of us to explore the other symphonies as well. Because as we've said, hey, this is just like what he's exploring here and here and here. There's a lot of tools I think we've learned to get into the other ones in a similar way. But that is all I have for Brahms' Third Symphony. What about you, Evan?
Well, each of these four symphonies is distinctive, and yet there are also qualities that all four of them have in common, and or qualities that this symphony is like this other symphony, but not like this. So if you know one symphony, if you're really diving deeper into the Third Symphony after listening to this episode, that will help you, and I think encourage you as you continue to explore all four of Brahms' symphonies. They are certainly worth exploring.
Thanks for listening to Classical Breakdown, your guide to classical music. For more information on this episode, visit the show notes page at classicalbreakdown.org. You can send me comments and episode ideas to classicalbreakdown@weta.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, leave a review in your podcast app. I'm John Banther. Thanks for listening to Classical Breakdown from WETA Classical.